I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
All right, Lee, part 3 in the Journey to the West series.
So the last part we looked at was chapters 1 through 7 of the Journey to the West, which was mostly about Monkey King. There wasn't really much journeying.
Right.
Certainly nothing to the west. This episode of the Chinese Literature Podcast, we're actually going to introduce the other characters who kind of come along in the story after Monkey has this kind of almost tearing down heaven and then is put in a kind of hellish jail underneath a mountain.
Yeah. So there's 5 characters altogether. The next character you get in the book is the central one, Monk, the Tang monk. He is tasked by the Tang court to go get the scriptures. He has a long backstory. We're not going to be able to give all backstories throughout this novel.
It's kind of a murder mystery.
It's a murder mystery. The one thing I will say about it is that it is much, much cooler and more exciting than the actual character of Tang Monk.
He's kind of boring.
Kind of boring. God, he's so boring. He's a weepy, frail character. Anything that happens that's remotely bad, he immediately flips out.
And that's a good point. I think that's something we should point out because I know our listeners are going to want to hear that Tang Monk is actually based off of a long tradition in Chinese literature that goes back to one of the first narrative stories really in Chinese literature. That is, Mulian saves his mother. This is a story that was translated or kind of came to China via India through Central Asia via the Silk Road. It's one of the foundational stories in Chinese literature to the point where, I mean, the actual original text was lost. It was rediscovered in the early 20th century by a Hungarian-British archaeologist in the Dunhuang caves, but versions of it had been circulating for almost 1,000 years.
Right, and it's the monk in that one is pretty boring too.
He just cries. That's his superpower. He's a Buddhist.
Yeah.
He's a Buddhist superhero.
He's like one of the Mystery Men, that old superhero spoof from the 90s.
We did a podcast on him, I believe, several years ago.
The one the title of that story was just called The Great Magdalyana. I'm butchering that. Saves his mother from hell, and so it's literally about this monk whose personal righteousness and dedication to his family, to his mother, allows him to save her from the clutches of hell.
And Tang Monk is kind of the same sort of...
He's introduced into the story through his dedication to his family. So he's a committed monk. He never violates those vows. But that doesn't mean he's not a filial son. So he goes in search of the people who killed his father. We should note to the reader that his father was saved by the Dragon King underwater. We don't need to get too much into Tang Monk's backstory because if you read the novel, you'll see it actually has nothing to do with why he's chosen to go pick up the scriptures in the first place. It's a really cool story. I mean, as a detective story, you should check it out and read it for its own merits. But Tang Monk is effectively just a good monk, and he volunteers to go get the scriptures when the Tang court realizes, we're lacking something, right? An emissary from heaven lets them know, you guys think you're following the scriptures. You're not. You're totally missing some. You need to send someone to get them.
They're not lacking something. They're lacking nothing.
That's true.
Of course, in Buddhism, nothingness is the goal.
Wow, Lee. That's one of the nerdiest puns or jokes I've heard in a long time. I salute
Dalai
you,
Lama
sir.
is a listener, I'm sure.
I salute you, sir.
He is not what is the sound of the Dalai Lama
not clapping at our podcast? I think I pretty much know what that sounds like. We should see if he wants an interview. Just say nothing. That's what we encourage everyone else to do. So he agrees because he's a good monk. I'm going to go get the scriptures. Great. Shortly before this is actually where we get the introductions to some of the other characters. So the great Tathagata, who, for lack of a better phrase, is sort of the dude in charge of heaven, says, you know what, these people in China, this distant barbarian land here, they need the scriptures. We need to get someone to come get them. The Bodhisattva is sent down to find somebody. Now, along her way, she finds 3 creatures, right? One is in a lake of sand, one is a dragon, and the other attacks her effectively. But she meets 3 characters, gets them all to agree to serve the monk when he finds them. And so the monk sets out, and he meets them one at a time.
He first, if I remember correctly, meets Monkey, and then he each of these characters kind of joins him at the very beginning of the novel. So the first 7 chapters we already talked about. Then he kind of sets out in chapter 13, and each couple of chapters after that, he gains a new disciple until it's Tang Monk, and then Monkey, Pigsy, who is the second most important character in this novel, and then Sandy, who's kind of unimportant, and then the Tang Monk's horse,
who starts out as a dragon, and then has to become a horse because he eats the Tang Monk's horse. Each character doesn't recognize the Tang Monk when he appears and has to be enlightened as to who he is, and then they all agree to serve. But because the dragon ate his horse, he has to be the horse.
Which, to a certain degree, is a metaphor of for Buddhism. It's about kind of, not recognizing and then coming to a state of enlightenment.
Which, if you find yourself ever reading this and you think some of these characters are really flat, it's partly because for as much as this is a journey, and for as much as each character has their own sort of set of skills, set of weaknesses, etc., a lot of it is an allegory, a Buddhist allegory.
I think you can think all of it is really an allegory. We've talked about this before the show, how much of this story is an allegory versus how much of it is a novel. And we're using novel, I don't want to get too technical here. Novels kind of have an arc, the characters progress.
They grow and change.
Yeah, you and I disagree over whether or not each of these characters kind of grow. I think that's something more we'll tackle.
Yeah, we'll get that in a later, especially when we talk about the end of the novel.
Yeah, but these characters are really flat, especially Sandy and the horse, who really are kind of, they only come up a couple of times. They don't really have any kind of interesting things about them.
It reminds me of, if you ever read a serialized novel, one that was written properly serialized in the 19th century, where the writer's sort of making it up
like
from installment. Dickens or to some extent Dumas. And if you ever meet a character who just disappears from sight, you can guarantee that's the writer going, no one's going to like this character. I'll just quietly leave them on the side of the road. You can kind of see something like that happening here. It's almost like the author went, so Pigsy and Monkey are awesome. The other two kind of are not. They're boring.
And I think we'll discuss this more and more. This is an important part of this. Again, I hesitate to use the word, but novel.
Everyone knows the word novel.
Fine.
Good Lord.
So it's an important part of this novel. We don't know where it comes from, and we do know parts of it come from different places. I mean, I mentioned earlier in the episode, Tang Monk as a character comes from Mulian, which comes out of a series of stories that's transmitted via Central Asia. So we don't know where kind of the characters Pigsy, Monkey, Sandy, and the horse all come from. The horse is actually clearly, probably at least partially, a reference to a very famous horse that Kumarajiva, a famous Buddhist translator who translated the Heart Sutra, and it's still the version that a lot of people in China read today. He translated it from, I believe, Pali into Chinese, if I remember correctly. He was a son of a prince in Central Asia. His family background kind of like spanned Central Asia and China. He was captured, and to a certain degree, I think the horse is just a reference to this historical character important in Buddhism.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the novel is kind of a pastiche, as a lot of the novels are from Chinese history up until maybe the 20th century.
Shui Hu Zhuan, I think, is...
Yeah. They're all pastiches of various characters taken from famous stories. Modern readers are not going to know what those are. I certainly don't. I would have to do a lot of research to know what those are.
Because you're a comparatist, and so you don't know anything about China.
Exactly. But it's so to some extent, talking about this novel in this podcast, we also have to sort of talk about how do you come at this if you don't know anything about the history or backstory. And so what you're left with is 5 characters. One of whom is unquestionably the most dynamic and interesting, and that's Monkey King, or Sun Wukong.
Yeah. Another
who is less interesting, but still interesting, which is Pigsy. He has his own sort of battles and temptations, and it goes all the way down. Frankly, the Tang Monk, who's the most important, is just as flat as pancakes. He does the same kinds of things all the time. He never handles problems. The only thing he does, and this is important,
is he cries.
Well, he cries, but he also restrains the others. He's given the power. There's a band that he puts around Sun Wukong's head that constricts whenever Monkey disobeys him. And so he is able to control them, which we mentioned this is a Buddhist allegory. The Tang Monk is also sort of representative of the part of a human being that's meant to be able to control the passions. Like,
the
they're
mind.
dispassionate.
Yeah.
They don't, which is why he's so boring. He doesn't have passions. He's intentionally not supposed to have passions because that way he can control the passions.
So in Chinese, Tang Meng sort of represents Xin, that is kind of mind, heart. It's tough word to translate, but each of these characters, you're right, Rob, represents a particular passion. Monkey represents anger. Pigsy, of course, represents lust. That kind of all of that plays into this Buddhist allegory.
Yeah, and Pigsy, you mentioned Pigsy represents lust. We should mention that whereas Sun Wukong is usually prone to anger and flying off the handle, if there's a chance for Pigsy to sleep with something or eat something, that's what he's going to do, right?
Yeah, and Monkey, so one of the interesting things is Monkey never has that problem. You can say a lot of nasty things about Monkey as a bad character, or not a bad character as in uninteresting, but just like doing bad things. He's very naughty, but he never really eats that much. He never tries to sleep with anyone.
In fact, he avoids it several times.
And I think that once you start to notice that, and you can kind of get the Buddhist allegory that this novel is going
and
for.
It helps a lot. And we will talk the next episode, about a method to read and appreciate this that helps a lot. It's the same. It's equivalent to understanding how superhero stories work. Like that certain villains always face off against certain characters because that's just the way the battle's got to work a certain way.
Monkey, right? Pigsy, Sandy, the horse, they all have their own kryptonite.
Right, exactly. And understanding how that works is one of the keys to appreciating the novel. But for the purposes of this particular episode, the thing to keep in mind is that each character does represent some aspect of human struggle. And the most boring is meant on purpose to be somewhat boring. What's, to me, remarkable about this novel is that for all of its sort of constraints, it's allegorical, therefore it's not particularly deep. I mean, none of the characters have, long monologues about their youths in the, whatever.
Yeah. Monkey kind of does.
Kind of.
It's not deep. It's
not,
right. It's not like...
We're not talking about Proust.
We're not talking about, this is not even like Zhang Ailing or Pusong Ling or anything like that.
But what I will say, and this is partly it's the constraint of the genre, right? The author, the putative author anyway, Wu Cheng'en, is not writing a modern novel in the sense that we're going to explore all the ins and outs of these characters, right? They exist to get across a certain point. It's almost a polemic, right? What's interesting is that even with that, there's some very interesting episodes with these characters where they're more than just what they appear to be. And this is, I keep thinking of Milton whenever we talk about this. I don't think this is in the same class as Paradise Lost. That's just a personal.
In terms of the writing.
In terms of purely the writing. This is just a personal opinion, right? What's fascinating about the two of them together, though, is the moments in Milton when a character who's pretty much just supposed to be there as this person is righteous, or this is the Christ or something, becomes a little more than that. Now, the obvious parallel with Monkey, of course, is the character of Satan in Paradise Lost.
Yeah, I was going to point that out. Like, Christ in Milton is actually the most boring character ever, except for...
Not ever.
Except for...
I don't know, Lee. That's a competitive category, my friend.
Christ is definitely one of the most boring characters in Milton.
I don't know.
Satan,
in Milton.
In Milton.
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about Forever. I was like,
No. So in Milton, Christ is incredibly boring, even though supposedly he's the hero. And this is what William Blake said, is that William Blake accused Milton of being too friendly with Satan.
Right.
And certainly when you read Paradise Lost, Satan's definitely the most interesting character, just like Monkey's the most interesting character in Shioji, right?
And there's a very similar philosophy behind it, which is if you're going to exalt the hero has to have the absolute biggest, baddest possible enemy, right? So if Satan is flat and boring, the victory doesn't mean anything, right? But if Satan is immensely layered and powerful and deep, whatever, then the victory is over that, right?
Sure, but both of those fail to make the hero at all.
Agreed. I agree. I'm just saying that's the dynamic. So Sun Wukong here is presented as the most extreme version of this rage, this uncontrollable power, right? It was in Human Nature. Nietzsche would very much approve. So that in restraining it, it's supposed to reflect that much more on the Tang monk and the Buddhism that he practices, right? Now, does it succeed? Not really. But
keep in mind we're looking at 16th century sort of. I hate to use the word novel, but I think of it more
only a literary scholar would say. So I hesitate to use the word novel because only a literary scholar has like reams of information about what a novel's supposed to be.
Rob, did you just accuse me of being a literary scholar?
I kind of did.
Thank you.
And I apologize for that because you're not. You don't know anything. But
there's a first time for everything.
There's a first time. Next time you're going to accuse me of being a historian, and then we'll be on the same boat. No, but it is interesting. You have relatively flat characters that exist to get across an allegorical purpose, but there's some pretty amazing sections in this novel where you go, whoa, this is a little more than just an allegory here. This is pretty interesting.
And we talked about this in a previous episode of the series, that this novel, even though we're saying these characters are flat, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
No,
like,
no.
Like Superman is an incredibly flat
Very
character,
flat, so boring.
But, you know, he inspired lots of people in the 1950s and 1960s to whatever. Whatever it was that they did in the 1950s, I don't know. These characters are flat, but they also have inspired lots of people across Asia to enjoy them. So there is something there. We're not saying you have to have a three-dimensional character for it to be interesting.
And what, you know, I think we talked about this in a previous podcast, but I have to put this out there. So what comes but right before this, in terms of fiction in China, is The Water Margin, or Shui Hu Zhuan, Outlaws of the Marsh. What comes after this is Jin Ping Mei, which is light years beyond what this is. But Journey to the West is pretty significantly beyond what Outlaws of the Marsh is.
It's kind of transitional, right? Like in terms of characterization in Chinese literature, and we don't want to get too much into this, but it's actually a good podcast to get into it. But like the Shui Hu Zhuan, the Water Margins, that is a novel where characters are entirely flat.
Yeah.
You're starting to see some kind of depth in these characters.
And you're also seeing a real shift in language. This novel in particular, Journey to the West, has several registers of language. In fact, one of the things that translator Anthony Yu points out is that a lot of English translations wipe out the poetry altogether. And if you're going to really appreciate it as a literary work, you have to keep it in there because it changes the register completely. And one of the things that's interesting about reading the poetry is you realize just how vernacular the language of the story is compared to previous novels. We're seeing a shift in what you can do with how a character talks, how a character acts. When you have an allegory and you have this sort of supernatural elements, you can kind of blow the doors off it. You know, we talked last time about the chapters 1 to 7. One of the amazing things is just the gloves are off. Like, just let him go. Let's see what Sun Wukong does with no restraints whatsoever, right? So the allegorical thing in that case actually helps because, look, let's show what rage really looks like. What's just a total will to power with no restraints? That's the first 7 chapters, right? I've never seen that before this in Chinese literature.
And you know, this is one of the things that I've talked about that makes Monkey such an interesting character. I don't see anything before him in Chinese literature that's quite
nothing
like
it. No.
And I said this previously, and I still stand by it. I don't have any proof of this, but my suspicion is that Monkey comes from the character of Hanuman in Indic literature, and it's transmitted via the Silk Road from India to China. You know, we don't really have, again, no evidence of this, so this is completely suppositional, but I think that you can see in this character who's completely unlike anything we've seen before in Chinese literature, who clearly is a lot like Hanuman in that he's a monkey and he's constantly making mischief. There, you know, you can kind of connect the dots, and it's not. There's no proof. We don't have that textual chain, but there is something there, and it's really compelling.
And it does help explain why this character appears to come out of nowhere. Yes, there are characters in Chinese literature who are very powerful. Yes, there are characters who are filled with rage. There isn't one who just goes completely off the reservation. And this is why it's so interesting. So as we go forward with this
series,
we have a couple more episodes about the actual content of the novel. But just bear in mind the characters and their very allegorical nature, right? If you are yourself trying to read this at some point along with us or just on your own, and you find yourself going, man, these characters are flat. That's on purpose.
And that's okay.
And you can look, and the reason I say that's important is because it helps you find the moments when they're a little more than that, where you start seeing in the Chinese literary tradition this, yes, this is the form we're working with, but you know what? I think we can do more with these characters. Let's see what happens if we push it beyond what we're used to, because the novels that come after this increase immensely in complexity until you get to Hong Lo Meng or Dream of Red Chambers, and then, of course...
When you have these magnificent kind of... Hong Lo Meng is almost not a novel.
Almost,
but it's a work of art beyond a novel. It's hard to describe
it. It really is hard to describe it. Why do we not have a podcast on it? Well, that would be why. It's incredibly hard to do like a short series on something that both magnificent and hard to break down.
We should also point out there are other people doing a podcast on Hong Lo Meng.
Yes. Rereading the Stone. Yeah, make sure you check that out. We have colleagues working on that. It's really interesting. You definitely go look at it. Make sure you give us a shout out. Make sure you give us a review on your whatever podcasting service you use. Look us up on Twitter, ChinLitPod, Chinese Lit Pod on Instagram, Patreon, our beer fund, Chinese Literature Podcast. Send us an email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. One of the coolest things about doing this podcast has been
getting to contact folks. We get people from all over the world contacting us. We love hearing from you.
Love it. It's so much fun. Send us an email. We'll write back, I promise. Yeah. And look us up, leave us a review, and follow us.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.